Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. My colleague and co-host and friend, Gordon Chang, of the Daily Beast, is on the WMAL-provided ISDN from the Baltimore area, where Gordon is attending CPAC, but all eyes are on South China Sea. Gordon, a very good evening to you. I go immediately to the news, which is, earlier today, the Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, warned China against, quote, aggressive actions. The quote from the Secretary: China must not pursue militarization in the South China Sea. Specific actions will have specific consequences. Within hours, we have a report, this from Reuters, that China has sent several ships to a Spratly Island atoll called the Jackson Atoll, also called the Carino Atoll, to drive away Philippine fishermen. Gordon, this very much looks like the Chinese either anticipated Secretary Carter's statements or are completely indifferent to the U.S. Do we have a choice, Gordon?
Yes, John. I think what's happened is that Secretary Carter was making his remarks in response to what the Chinese were doing around Jackson Atoll, because clearly this is another Scarborough Shoal. In early 2012, Chinese vessels seized that shoal. Now they're trying to take Jackson, and the United States just is sort of left behind because it doesn't know what to do.
So the order we should read this is, we knew about the Jackson Atoll incident, and Carter spoke of it, but Gordon, he's threatening them for something they just did, right? That's what he did. They did it, so he threatened them not to do it.
Right, and essentially what we have is a rhetorical response from the United States, really not backed up by anything. And we're going to have to see in the next 2 or 3 days whether the administration does anything to impose a cost on China for clearly aggressive, provocative, belligerent behavior.
We welcome our colleague James Holmes, professor of strategy at the Naval War College. He's a former surface warfare officer. Surface warfare of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that have sailed within the 12-mile limit of these phony claims, these unrecognized claims by the Chinese, both at the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands. Jim, a very good evening to you. This is an escalation cycle, and Secretary Carter's words, not backing them up, advantage China. Does the aggressor have the advantage in a warfare conflict like this?
Hey, gentlemen, glad to be on with you again. I think the answer is yes. I think that China is quite aware of that. It's actually solidly grounded in what the classics of strategy say. There's a real advantage to grabbing something and then daring somebody to come out and take it away from you at high cost, potentially, and high danger to themselves. Also, if you do that, you can make the other guy look like the bad guy, which is always a key in international competition. So yeah, I think we may be in another one of those situations as well.
Gordon?
Jim, there are reports, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry today confirmed that it had withdrawn its ships. But this seems to be just like a temporary response to what the Philippines was going to do. Clearly, at this point, it seems that China has the initiative, and Washington is pretty much clueless as to what to do, because it always seems that we're left with these rhetorical responses that are terribly out of date and don't impress the Chinese.
Well, I'm not sure I would go on record calling my employer clueless, but I do think that Teddy Roosevelt sketched a very wise rule back when he talked about speaking softly, not being overly confrontational, but also backing up what you mean with force and being. And I think I have to agree with the spirit of what you said, and I think we haven't entirely gotten this right. We do seem to be moving in that direction as far as consulting with our potential allies, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, and India. But at the same time, it's very hard to get all those interests and power flowing in the same direction to put up an effective deterrent to this sort of thing.
To repeat the Arleigh Burke-class events at the Spratlys and the Paracels, is that adequate, James, or do we need to go to another tool?
Well, I think we actually have to distinguish between the islands themselves, or that Jackson Island is an atoll, Jackson Atoll is an atoll, and therefore it's basically a rock that sticks above the water at high tide, and thus it has certain legal prerogatives. So I think, in my personal view, we're not going to do anything about the islands. I think that is just going to sort itself out. We've been so long on record saying that we take no position on the who holds the islands. I think that's a very difficult thing for us to do. What the United States and what its partners need to do is make sure that China is not able to take those islands and then use those to claim things that are not warranted in international law in the waters and skies around those. So I'm not saying that I like the idea of giving up the islands, but I think that's just reality.
Gordon?
Well, Jim, what we could do is we could have our Navy, for instance, swarm Scarborough Shoal, where the Chinese have yet to start reclamation. And before the Chinese start reclamation, we can always take those areas back with superior force. Now, I know that that's risky, but unfortunately, we have been left now with risky alternatives. There are no good alternatives anymore, and we cannot let an aggressor keep possessions, because if we do that, we know what the 1930s cycle looks like.
Well, I mean, we're sort of doubling back to the discussion we had a few times ago about. And again, I'm not recommending this. I'm telling you what I think political reality is. I do not think we have decided that water territory and airspace are the same thing as territory, land territory, which is what you're referring to when you talk about the 1930s. And I'm pretty sure. In fact, I would almost bet my next month's paycheck that the Allies cannot get together on that question. Now, I think I would backtrack a little bit and meet you halfway. I think there are some instances in which we could do something useful to try to help the Southeast China Sea powers hold what they already have. For example, it's the Second Thomas Reef is where it's kind of a ridiculous story, but the Philippines marooned an old World War II U.S. Navy ship there back in the late 1990s, and they keep a team of Philippine Marines on board. That seems like the kind of thing where we might be able to help the Philippines hold that, perhaps by putting a small contingent of our own U.S. Marines on there. There could be creative options there as well, but it doesn't appear that the Philippines really has much ability to hold Jackson Atoll.
Gordon, I ask you about the Philippines and the Philippines government. Is it stable? Is it capable of answering? Has it been penetrated by Chinese money?
Well, yes, Chinese money is just all throughout Manila and throughout the national government as well. But nonetheless, I think there is a pretty important streak in Philippine thought that they're not going to give up any of these features to the Chinese. There is a presidential election there now, and we don't know exactly how the candidates are going to govern. I mean, should they be elected? There is one candidate who has got a pretty soft view on this. So, but for the most part, though, the Filipinos are just not going to give an inch.
The puzzle, James, for me, Ashton Carter's statement is unambiguous. I understand it. He's warning against aggressive actions, and therefore we have this report of aggressive actions. Does that mean that Ashton Carter's been unhorsed, that his words are no longer significant to the Chinese?
It's possible. I mean, there's several different ways to look at this. First of all, just to throw out two. First of all, I think that to go out there in public and make a public statement like the Secretary did today, and then not back it up, that is, as you say, that does tend to unhorse you especially in power politics, really hard bargaining international politics. So I think that's one aspect of it, and. But again, just with regard to the Philippines, I agree with Gordon. I don't see that they will flinch a bit, politically speaking. But as we know, when you talk about actually mounting strength, putting strength out there to get your way, resolve is only one part of it. Physical capability is somewhere the Philippines are utterly outmatched. They simply cannot stand against the Chinese in any sense whatsoever.
Gordon, one more question.
Yeah. Jim, we know that there's 2 Japanese minesweepers that are now in Philippine port. There is an agreement that was just inked between Tokyo and Manila on defense cooperation. This seems to be one way to help the Filipinos actually build up their capabilities.
Yeah, but again, if you look at the size of the Philippine defense budget, the Philippines, if they were to put their entire defense budget into naval development for 1 year, they could buy one of our Arleigh Burke-class destroyers with their entire defense budget, and so that gives you an idea of just how much they have to put into physical capacity. We got to get this alliance thing right, and the allies are going to have to take on the bulk of the material side if we're going to actually put up a serious deterrent out there.
Professor James Holmes, Professor of Strategy at the Naval War College. The news from the South China Sea is that the Chinese PLA Navy is on the march. The news from San Francisco, from the DOD, is we don't like it. Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast, he's at WMAL's connection to CPAC in Baltimore. I'm John Batchelor.